Good morning. Okay, everything's working. All right. My name is Agnes Sastre. I'm from the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras Campos. I am very happy to be here. I'm very grateful, and I'm excited to show to y'all a little section of what is my Mellon Mays undergraduate fellow paper that I've been working on for like a year and a half now. It's been a journey. I'm excited to welcome you in. So, the Caribbean has been the perfect landscape for lusting, party-going, relaxation-seeking tourists. With clear blue skies ahead and the perfect golden sand and a piña colada on the side, who wouldn't want to get a shot of visiting heaven's place on earth, if only for a week? Big tourism companies have developed over the years the perfect marketing strategies to reinforce the idea that these islands are God-sent and fabricated for their pleasure. This should not come as a surprise since the script was well rehearsed and studied, Christopher Columbus being the first one to write down in his journals how beautiful, inviting, and exploitable the Caribbean was. However, this utopia is one-sided. It is lived and seen only through the eyes of tourists and multilateral companies. In contrast of the reality of the narratives of the people who inhabit the Caribbean and the way they live and speak. For the purpose of this research, I will be focusing on a comparative reading of selected trauma narrative novels by Niall Thomas from the island St. Vincent and Chani Moto from Trinidad. Thomas and Moto are among Caribbean authors whose narratives detail the various traumas endured by Caribbean people. The stories that they narrate are complex both in narrative strategies and interpretations, and I will explore and study the similarities in their work to uncover areas in which they converge and areas in which they differ. In my study, I will closely read the Caribbean spaces, the land and landscapes that carry deep-rooted traumas and suffering, and how these spaces interact with social, psychological, and historical events that work against the individuals who happen to live and travel across these spaces. For this presentation, I will be sharing some of my initial findings of the parallels that I find in Niall Thomas' Returns to Arcadia and Chani Moto's Sirius Blooms at Night. I set on the task of studying these texts in a context in which they are written, acknowledging the tragedies that they tell, and trying to untangle the complexities that they carry. To do that, I will engage in intersectional methodology as proposed by scholars such as Angelique V. Nixon and Rosamund S. King. Intersectionality will enable me to integrate feminist theory, queer theory, post-colonial trauma theory, towards a fully exploration of issues of race, gender, and sexuality that the characters confront and respond to in these texts. This is of importance because, as the quote says, if we examine sexuality without attention to color, race, class, rural, or urban location, and other aspects of identity, then we are quite literally not considering the whole person, and these omissions will diminish our research and its results. When I originally began this research, I looked only at how specific characters responded to very specific oppressions, not paying attention to other oppressions that these characters face. But as I began to read more about Caribbean literature and Caribbean theory, I realized that my ways of study were limited, and this will only cause harm. I needed to expand my view, and to do so, I considered other aspects of Caribbean lives that these characters dealt with. My goal is to explore narratives and similarities in their experience and/or differences between the characters in these novels, who at first glance appear to have very different stories, singular struggles and varied traumas, yet all sharing similar spaces, a cycle of hereditary trauma that they seek to be freed from. And I argue that these narratives act as witnesses to these traumas, and through my study of these texts, I hope to bring a greater sense of awareness to these issues that are articulated in this text, but continue to be left underexposed. The authors whose texts I've decided to study come from similar experiences as queer folk raised in conservative Caribbean islands. In the island of St. Vincent, in which Niall Thomas was raised, homosexuality to this day is punishable by law, and in the case of Chanimoto, the island of Trinidad had just recently, in the past year, decriminalized homosexuality. In interviews and autobiographical reflective work they've done, both of these authors have expressed that living in these islands as an openly gay person was of high risk for their well-being, or to put in Moto's words, just not possible to live there. This is why the authors immigrated to Canada and currently work as professors of different universities in the country. Although both authors have different disciplinary interests, for example, Moto has a strong visual art background and self-identifies as first a painter and second a writer. And while Niall Thomas has more of like a medical, mental health related background, he used to work as a nurse in a psychiatric hospital. They are both have fascinating ways of narrating and twisting many intersectional struggles in their work, which I find fascinating and overwhelming. And it is also interesting to me to note that although both of them have a similar focus and background, I have become more aware of the lack of academic study and poor circulation of Niall Thomas's books in comparison to Moto's work, where it has been heavily circulated in comparison to Thomas and studied, and she's even received awards for her work. The question of why Thomas's work is one that has, I've been thinking about, and why, in comparison to Chanimoto, hasn't received as much attention as it should be merited, is a question I keep very present in my research, and I hope to answer at some point. Thus far, although the texts explore very different storylines, there are multiple occasions when they find common ground. Both texts are narrated through a third-person point of view that it constantly navigates through time to tell the fragmented story of mentally ill protagonists. In Return to Arcadia, the reader is walking with Joshua Clare through his journey of healing, in which, with the help of traditional medicine and more spiritual alternatives, he begins to recover from a severe memory loss. Each section of the book is dedicated to a specific moment in his life, and the reader gets to witness it. Similarly, series Blooms at Night is also an invitation to witness the telling of the life of Mala, an old woman who has the case of dementia but hasn't received clinical help, thus is dismissed in her town as a crazy old lady. The witnessing of these stories of mentally characters serve as a way to firstly understand the trauma that is caused by societal pressures that surround both Mala and Joshua had experienced from a young age, both exposed to racial discrimination, Joshua being a mixed child and Mala as an Indian child raised in predominantly white territories of the island. In the case of Joshua, he is raised in what used to be a plantation, and that continues to be seen and has it is a colonial space, and it has all these historical connotations to it. And he is raised by his stepmother, who tears him away from his biological mother because he is the child of the owner of the plantation. Like a trigger warning, kind of late, but yeah, he is the child of a woman who is raped. And Mala, who is the daughter of an Indian man who was adopted into a Christian family and later converted to Christianity, which is, and who is whitened in this space, forced to reject his culture, and secondly, to observe how bodies are also abused by figures that are traumatized. Mala is abused by her father, who has already internalized self-hate and internalized racism, who wants to demonstrate he can be masculine after his wife runs away with another woman. Joshua is abused by his step-uncle, a white man who has internalized homophobia thanks to his religious upbringing and is then spreading his homophobia in his preaches when he serves as a pastor in the island, and then ultimately assaults Joshua. I have observed in most of these texts that cyclical transmission of trauma to the use of oppressing figures that are, in both cases, linked to Christianity. This is why in my research I proposed that Christianity, and I use this term very vaguely because both authors present different kinds of Christianity, religion, denominations in the text, and specifically Nadia Thomas decides not to name the denomination just to kind of keep it open and to interpretation, which are we talking about, and serves as a way of a process of re-traumatizing and recolonizing marginalized bodies in the Caribbean. In a process I've decided to name indoctrination, and I'm currently in the process of defining, theorizing, and solidifying it. That's it. I would like to thank my mentor, Dana Bankuama from the English department at the UPR. He is the sweetest, and I am very grateful that he's been bearing with all the things I decided to incorporate in my research. I also would like to thank the MMUF UPR staff and my cohort, which me lo llevo, and my family and friends for their support. I would also like to thank the MUSE Scholars staff, faculty, and cohort for the opportunity to be here and for your attention today.